Well, thank you all for joining us for the fourth in the five-part series. Your patience and diligence for those who have been with us all the way through. We are going to actually reschedule the fifth and final one for right after the holidays as a little bit of a gift for folks who are tired of Zooming and want to get their year-end work done. But we'll wrap up on a very exciting panel that I think you'll enjoy. For today, we're really pumped, and I'll have a further introduction and she can give a lot of background on herself, but we're really pumped to have Ellory Monks from the Atlas join us on one of the key items that has always been a challenge in any discussion about public-private partnerships, which is around procurement, contracting, and performance-based outcomes. As I was describing to Mike earlier, we can have all the great projects, all the financing, some of the best, legal, financial, operating minds sitting together. But if there is not a way to engage with the public sector from a procurement and contracting approach, and especially one that is well defined at the beginning of the process, it makes these P3, especially again in the flood and risk mitigation world, more challenging. As some of you have heard, we have this mission that we've outlined for 2021, and I'll make a few additional announcements towards the end of what we have in store for the first quarter of 2021, including the expansion of our partnership and relationship with the Insurance Information Institute, and most importantly, the opportunity to move forward with this P3 marketplace in Texas with AKX. I thought I'd highlight a couple of items and then have this be a lead-in, Ellory, to your introduction. When we started looking at risk reduction, especially from both federal and private sector insurance, and from the mix of potential assets and infrastructure on which to apply P3s, our local objectives that we have captured and curated, not just in Texas, but across the country, is that this really is looking for ways to leverage underutilized or frankly unknown assets in communities, not just the presence of a detention retention pond or a channel or whatever the source is of the infrastructure. It really now has become somewhat around the smart cities concept, a way of leveraging assets in ways that may not have been previously considered. The second finding is that there is a connection, it's obvious, between what happens upstream and typically what happens downstream, especially in areas of low to moderate income neighborhoods. And so part of our analysis is that by connecting the upstream fortification of any type of the assets that we're talking about and recognizing the impact for low and moderate income neighborhoods, Ellory, and I'm sure you'll talk about this, this is now much more of a criteria or element that's built into some of the new federal dollars, whether it's the FEMA dollars or the HUD dollars, and how that ultimately becomes a part of a procurement needs to be recognized. And then this connection between that, to some degree, there's been stovepipes about what we can do in residential, which is primarily, sad but true, been focused on buyouts, but also what can you do with residential and large-scale multifamily, or in this case, that we've been looking at it and exploring around this issue of planned and mastered communities side by side with commercial interest. That means that there are a number of private sector landowners and asset owners that need to be brought to the table. And again, I think, Ellory, that's one of the things is how do we incentivize and bring those private sector interests to the table. Now, there's any number of ways to look at, and I promise I am not going to go through any of this, but just to highlight that we're well past the idea of what are the public-private partnership models. I mean, it's everything from design, build to design, build, and operate, maintain, to this idea that there are conventional activities of your normal kind of contracting and procurement to some new forms of engaging with and sharing risk. And we've heard that from the insurance industry already in some of their prior conversations. But Ellory, for purposes of today, I think, one of the opportunities is to look at and begin to find ways to demonstrate this, pay for performance, all the way over to the stormwater credit purchase, which is one of the things that we've seen around the Chesapeake Bay between Walmart, the Nature Conservancy, and the state of Maryland. So the fact is that we're kind of well past the institutional nature of what a public-private partnership is to now finding ways to adapt these prior models to where we can go with flood and risk mitigation. And then last but not least is, if this was a simple set of steps and stages, it would have been done. So by no means do we want to imply that P3s are, quote unquote, the silver bullet, or boy, you just got to find the template and everything suddenly comes together. Let's be honest, there's still steps in the procurement process for transparency, ethics, and there are components that need to be addressed. And that means that unless you really have this type of assessment process, in Ellory, this is your field, but I just wanted to highlight, that A, it's multi-stage, B, it has some complexities to it, as does anything that becomes an innovation. But we have the tools. There are tools and templates on which to apply. So we're not starting from scratch with any community, any public entity. So our agenda for today, which is to swiftly introduce Ellory and turn over the presentation to her. Ellory and I have agreed that she's going to make a presentation, but it'll be conversational. And then we look forward to you putting any of your questions and posting those so that we can address some of those. And then 15 minutes of getting a little bit deeper into Mike Gardner from AKX, our partner, to share a little bit more on the functionality. And then, as I said, we'll do a little wrap up and share some next steps for 2021. So, Ellory, the screen and the stage is yours, and hopefully you can pull your presentation up without difficulty.
Sounds good. Give me 1 second and I'll share my screen.
You got it. And while you're doing that, I'll give a little bit about Ellory, but I want her to make a more formal introduction. But I got to know Ellory and her partner several years ago, and some of you may know of them from their prior leadership of Refocus, RE-Focus. So this is not new for their work by any means. And most importantly, what I really love is Ellory and her partners have formed a significant set of toolkits, which you'll hear about. But the fun part that I have found about Ellory is I've never heard you say, no, it can't be done. Now that may be, you're just being nice to me, but I do know for a fact that your perspective has always been, if there's a, if there is a defined opportunity, there's always a way to get to it. So, Ellory, with that introduction, you have the stage.
I appreciate that. You guys can all hear me and see my screen, right? Everything's looking good? Richard? Awesome. So Richard just introduced me at a high level. I'm Ellory. I'm a co-founder of The Atlas. The Atlas is a free online community. Hold on, you guys, 1 second. I'm getting, I think these slides are moving automatically. Hold on 1 second, guys.
Okay.
What's going on here?
I have to remind myself and all of our participants that no matter how much we try to do this in Zoom, it at the same time reflects, Ellory, the same problems that we would have if we were in the same room, that the computers tend to want to take over and tell us what they want to do. So.
Well, listen, I probably touched my mouse. Hopefully this doesn't keep happening the entire time.
Cool.
But we'll see. So I'm co-founder of The Atlas. The Atlas is a free online community of local government officials and staff to do three things. The first is to browse case studies. The second is to follow trending topics in local government. And God, you guys, I don't know what's going on here. Let me try something different.
Okay.
I'm gonna try
you may
Google
have
slide mode.
Yeah, you may have your presentation on a timer.
Yeah, it shouldn't be, but give me
No problem.
let me try I'm gonna try something totally different.
Okay. And again, as you're doing that, Ellory, one of the reference points is that, and again, you'll explain this a lot better than I would, is
this is a PDF. Whoever just recommended a PDF, it is a PDF,
yes.
Which is why I'm very confused.
Is that the research and work that you all did under Refocus, I think has really served to inform where you all are now in continuing that kind of advisory services to elected and appointed officials. And Ellory, if it still works up for you, then what I'll do is I'll take it back and I'll show it on my end and see if that works.
Yeah, I was gonna say I can pull it up. It just won't be full screen. I can, but Richard, if you have it and you can
go
pull
ahead
it
and
up.
pull it up, and even if it's not full screen, we'll get it out to folks.
Okay.
Go ahead and try on your end.
All right. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, but I think, Ellory, one of the things that I've learned from you and Elle over the past few years has really been this ability to, and if you hit your green screen, I don't know if I'll make it bigger up there on the far left.
Yeah, that's what I was.
Okay.
This is when it goes into. Well, let's try it. Let's try it.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, let's start over. So the Atlas is a free online community for local government officials. We have about 3,000 local government officials and staff that use the Atlas each month. Primarily, they're using that case study database that I referenced. It's all member published case studies of best practices on the ground of what's working in local governments around the world. Innovative stuff like tech and software and all that kind of stuff, but also very in the weeds implementation of P3s and design, build, operate, and maintain kind of runs the gamut. It's not just focused on the water sector or sustainability, but that's where our roots are, as Richard was referencing my past life. So we tend to be really strong in water and sustainability, but we cover a very wide range of local government issues: transportation, water, police, process stuff, kind of across the board, communications across the board. So today, really I've been invited to talk about how procurement can enable innovation and enable better outcomes rather than stymie them. And ultimately, this is drawing on kind of my bird's eye view of what's happening in all of those local governments that are on our platform across the board. And when you have that bird's eye view, it's a really cool position to be in because it elevates, it just elevates some really interesting lessons learned. Definitely feel free to interrupt, by the way, chime in while I'm doing this, but I'm going to just get us rolling. So right now, we have a bunch of compounding trends: revenue loss because of COVID-19, aging infrastructure in the United States, an incredible access to data like we've never had before, and really serious advancements in technology. Have communities across the country looking for ways to leapfrog to safer, smarter, more sustainable solutions. And government procurement can often be a stumbling block towards innovation. And you guys know that as well as I do, right? Procurement doesn't have the reputation it has for nothing. Even when a city knows what it needs, public procurement processes are often biased against new, cross-cutting, resilient solutions. And ultimately, if we don't make major improvements in the procurement tools and processes that government agencies use, agencies are going to continue to replace failing systems with the same old fixes rather than transitioning to better, cheaper, and more sustainable systems. And that's where this quote that's up on the slide comes in. Ultimately, building safer, smarter, more sustainable water, transport, and energy systems requires going beyond traditional purchasing processes. And ultimately, like, standard pre-development and purchasing processes aren't going to help local government agencies pursue innovative outcomes, whether it's in resilience or whether it's in smart cities, whatever it is. And ultimately, right, that's true regardless of how much money we have, regardless of federal stimulus, regardless of how much money is available. Our standard pre-development and purchasing processes are going to stand in the way and are standing in the way.
Ellery, I was going to raise that
Yes.
point, and that is, given the issues of revenue loss, aging infrastructure, the abundance of access to data, we suddenly also are finding ourselves with abundant access to non-governmental resources. But I think it's the point that you raise, and that is, all of that is wonderful, but it's got to start ultimately at a document that drives a transaction. Am I saying that right?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. And what I'm going to get into in a minute or two is I'm going to actually start sharing examples of really good procurements and scopes of work that are really tightly scoped in a way that open themselves up to different unique partnerships and open themselves up for innovative finance and P3 structures and all kinds of good things. Because it all starts with a really good problem statement ultimately. And that was actually the point I was just about to make, which is that ultimately a shift towards performance-based procurements and towards some of these more innovative procurements ultimately has the potential to unlock an incredible amount of private capital. Ultimately, private investors have really significant resources right now to finance the construction of infrastructure projects. And a lot of them are actively looking for well-designed projects to invest in, but they'll tell you that they're unable to find applicants and projects that meet their specifications. The flip side, like, I work almost exclusively with local governments, you hear the complete opposite from local government officials and agencies, right? Which is that they have this enormous financing gap, this $2 trillion infrastructure financing gap, and they're desperate for capital. Ultimately, right, a lot of the reason for that mismatch is what we're talking about bridging today, right? Ultimately, that's the role of P3, is a really well-scoped P3 bridges that gap, essentially. Any questions so far?
Keep on going.
All right. So like I said, today my goal is to really challenge us to think of how procurement can actually enable innovation rather than stymie it. Ultimately, all government procurement is a means to an end. Procurement innovation is not the end in and of itself. It can be really easy to lose sight of that because there has been a lot of work in various agencies to streamline rules and to reduce regulations and all that kind of good stuff. And that work is all very, very, very important. But when we're talking about P3s and performance-based contracting and attracting private capital, we really need to think about how state and local government officials can envision the best possible ends and outcomes, not just the best possible means, which is the procurement processes. You guys probably know this, but in the last several years, several local governments have made tremendous progress in deploying these types of performance-based contracts and more innovative procurements. This is kind of what Richard was saying when he was saying, like, we're past the theory now, we're in practice. That's very much the case. One of my favorite examples from the water sector is the PG County, Prince George's County in Maryland, their clean water project, their clean water partnership. That's been heavily in partnership with Corvius. You guys, again, probably are familiar with this, but I'll give you a high level because I think it's a good marker to anchor us to what we're actually talking about. The partnership was launched in 2020. The goals of the contract were to significantly improve stormwater management across the county and build a more equitable and diverse local workforce for project implementation. So very specifically, the metrics that were set out were to deliver green stormwater retrofits on 2,000 impervious acres at a cost of no greater than 100 million within a 3-year term. That all of those metrics were far met and exceeded in that first 3-year term, and the partnership is ongoing. It's a really good example, and I encourage you guys to research and read about it if you are not familiar with it at all. But it's a really good example of a performance-based partnership, a P3 partnership in the water sector that really, honestly, has really moved the needle on resilience and sustainability in PG County.
Is that case study on the Atlas?
Yeah, and it's also
Okay,
in. We've also, and I was about to mention this. This is also not just. What was that?
Sorry, I'm jumping ahead. I didn't mean to. Go ahead.
Oh, no worries. I was going to say, this is also a lot of these recommendations that I'm about to get into very specifically right now are not just based on like high level observations of what's going on in our online community. It's also very specifically based on grant funded work that we did with the support of the Xprize Foundation in partnership with Refocus Partners, which Richard mentioned earlier. And we wrote extensively about the Clean Water Partnership in that work. And I can send you, Richard, as a follow-up if you're going to share any follow-up materials. We did a bunch of, there's a procurement toolkit that you guys are going to see screenshots of in a second. And there's some really good writing about the Clean Water Partnership in that work that I can share.
Cool.
So I'm going to share basically 3 really, really high level recommendations that we've seen in terms of pursuing more outcomes-based procurements. And then I'm going to share some like rapid fire, very like tactical tips and tricks at the end. But I'm going to start off with 3 really big ones. The first really big recommendation is to frame the problem, not the solution, in all solicitations. This is the case if you're talking about like just a routine RFP and you're looking for better outcomes in your routine RFPs. But it's also true when you're talking about more innovative methods as well. I think generally speaking, it's really easy for people to think that being prescriptive and as specific as possible is better in any procurement. And I would say that's not necessarily true. Being too prescriptive can actually limit innovation, and it can discourage partners and solutions that may be able to generate wider benefits. This is very much true of P3s, right? A private sector partner may not see themselves in a really prescriptive, really specific RFP scope of work, but if you open things up and say that you're open to more creative ways to solve the pain point, you may get more creative solicitations. My favorite organization that does this unbelievably well is the Xprize Foundation, or if you guys are familiar. They do a series of competitions that have what are ostensibly very simple challenges, but when you dig deeper, the challenge statements are incredibly sophisticated and well thought out. And they have a really proven track record of enabling innovation. So I'll give you one specific example of a challenge that they did. They did an Untitled Xprize that was really looking at spurring on commercial space travel. And the challenge statement that they issued was that folks needed to get 3 people 100 kilometers above the Earth and back twice in 2 weeks. It's really important in that example to note, like, Xprize is not telling people how to do that, right? They're defining the outcomes that they want, and they're leaving the methods and the means of how folks will actually do that completely up to the private sector to let them figure out how they want to do it, right? And they're just defining really, really specific, really, really well thought out outcomes. And ultimately, for local governments, taking this more outcomes-based approach, even to more routine RFPs, like I'm about to share more innovative procurement methods in a second, but even in more routine procurements, taking this more outcomes-based approach to scopes of work can protect a local government from asking for something that's actually outdated, and they might not even know it from a technology perspective, especially. And that's really important when you're talking about resilience, smart cities, innovation, all that kind of good stuff. I'm going to pause for a second. Any questions or anything I can respond to right now?
I've got a list, but I'm going to wait.
Okay. And what I'm showing you on this slide, this is actually a screenshot from that toolkit I was referencing. It's available on our website on theatlas.com. It's free, all that kind of good stuff. I encourage you to click around it. It's a procurement toolkit, essentially. It helps folks write better scopes of work and consider whether or not performance-based contracting may or may not be a good fit. So we just talked about the Xprize example. Ultimately, a really good problem statement has a specific goal, a sense of scale, and clear and quantifiable outcomes. So using resilience stormwater as an example, there's a really enormous difference between essentially saying, our city wants to build green infrastructure, or our city wants to expand green infrastructure, versus we are looking for green stormwater management solutions on public property that can create operation and maintenance savings for our city. Those are two wildly different things. And ultimately that second statement, especially because of that create operation and maintenance savings for our city, that phrase, adding that into a scope of work, that gives private sector partners a trail of breadcrumbs for a P3, right? When you start saying we're interested in looking at savings, maintenance savings, that can be the basis for a really beautiful P3. And that's baking it into the procurement itself. Any questions so far?
I'm going to introduce a question.
Yes.
I fear that this is such a big question that it opens up a can of worms, but I just want to put it out there. All right.
Please.
In any of the P3s that I've been involved with or been around or reviewed, God love it, but there's nothing better than a fight over definitions and taxonomy.
Yeah.
So as much as I may have cost effective and equitable, how do you try to avoid and I'm not going to pin this just on the lawyers, but you're going to have the lawyers, the engineers, everybody start fighting over a definition, which I fear is a delay tactic to some degree. But what am I making sense, Ellory? Is that?
Yeah, for sure.
It sounds so clear.
I mean, that's
what it is, but
yeah, I mean, so that's ultimately right. Like what you just brought up, I think is really the case on the implementation side of a P3.
yes.
Not necessarily the case for a solicitation, right? Nobody should be arguing about the definition of sustainability or equity when they're submitting a response to a solicitation, right?
Yep.
At that point, they can go with their own definition, and then it's up to the local government to decide if they like how they defined equity, ultimately.
Yep.
What you're bringing up, I think, is more of an implementation issue. And I think it's the most serious barrier to implementing performance-based contracts, which is ultimately that there is a tremendous amount of capacity that's required to do the ongoing, basically data and monitoring and analysis to actually execute a performance-based contract like this. And it's not just lawyers arguing over definitions, it's also, um, you know, it's also engineers and data scientists arguing over data and data streams and data quality and all that kind of stuff too. Especially when payments are tied to that data. So, I think ultimately, right, like that's why a performance-based contract is not always the best fit, right? It is not always the right decision for every local government agency to pursue a performance-based contract, because ultimately it does require a lot of baseline data and a lot of existing capacity to actually execute and to do it well. But that being said, just because you may not want to tie payments to performance does not mean that local government agencies, even that may have less data and that may be lower capacity, that they shouldn't be taking lessons, right, from taking a more outcomes-based, performance-based approach. Right? Like the lessons still remain the same in terms of being able to scope RFPs and all that kind of stuff around the outcomes that you want, rather than predetermining what the exact solution is going to be.
Your intent never goes away.
Exactly.
The intent never goes away. Right. Keep on going. I didn't mean to, but I think that this is a part of defining, looking at the front end tied to the implementation on the back end. So keep on going.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the other thing that I'll say before I move on is, like, ultimately, right, with a really good problem statement and with everybody on the same page about what is really what everybody is seeking to achieve together, it should fix a lot of the problems on the back end.
Yep.
Unless you have just like a bad actor, which happens. That can happen. But assuming everybody is coming into it with good intentions, like doing the upfront work on the scoping and on the challenge statement should actually streamline a lot of the implementation issues.
Go ahead.
So that was my first, like, really major recommendation, is to think about the scope of work and to frame the pain point or the problem that is actually trying to be addressed, rather than predetermining what the solution is that you want to use. My second really big recommendation is to consider using new tools. I already started talking about this a little bit. I think there is a place in a lot of local government agencies to just write better RFPs and to go about that process in a better way. But for some local government agencies and for some folks that are probably listening to this, there is more internal capacity. There is better baseline data, and there is more of a desire to do things a little bit more innovatively. And that's where doing some of these more creative procurements can come into place. Ultimately, if you're really trying to break out of what you've been doing over and over and over again, and you're really trying to jumpstart a resilience process or innovation across a local government or whatever that may be, these new procurement tools can be a really good mechanism for doing that, because they break you out of doing what you've always done. I'm going to walk through them at a really high level. You guys are probably familiar with most of these. We've already been talking extensively about performance contracts, but I'm going to talk through them each at a really high level, give you some pros and cons and some examples. So requests for ideas, or RFIs, are basically an open call for ideas. And the pros of this is that they allow a local government to basically crowdsource ideas. It's saying, we don't know what we don't know. Let's ask experts in the community about what they think we should do. The cons of this is that because it's the least specific, it's the least well scoped of these three options, a lot of the ideas that a local government gets back from the RFI might not be relevant, might not be practical, et cetera, et cetera. That being said, they are and they can be really good to use if a local government does not necessarily know very much about a topic and wants help discovering what the possibilities could be for new ideas and new partners to pursue a solution. Boston, the city of Boston, Philadelphia, and Atlanta all use RFIs with pretty great success, and they do it across a variety of different areas. But there are some really good examples from each of those cities. Questions about that? Okay. A competition or challenge. These tend to be really splashy, so you guys have probably are familiar with a lot of these. But basically, a design competition or challenge is an open call for solutions based on a really bold problem, and there's a very specific prize or incentive for one or the top finalist entries. This is more of the Xprize example that I just gave. There are examples in the resilience space, like many of them. You guys are familiar with lots of them. Rebuild by Design. I don't need to get into that, but the competitions and challenges have been used with varying levels of success in the resilience and sustainability fields. The pros of pursuing more of a competition style is that it can enable a city to test out a couple of different options before locking into something that's completely unknown. You can choose a couple of winners that get to pilot their technologies or pilot their solutions, for example, and then after the pilot phase, the winner then goes to deployment. The con of pursuing a competition or challenge is that there's a lot of capacity that's required to run one of these well, and not I won't beat around the bush. Like, a lot of local governments don't have the internal capacity to necessarily do this. That being said, especially in the resilience and water sector, there are nonprofit and university partners that have indicated a lot of interest and have a lot of experience running competitions like this. So I think there are. Go ahead.
Yeah, Ellory, I think that this goes to the point is that there are these neutral entities, and we have a couple of foundations and nonprofits that are listening in. I just want to plant the seed is that there is this role that has really emerged for the nonprofit, NGO / world that is also playing this bridge and kind of creates that additional capacity for bringing both the public and private sector together. You mentioned the Xprize, there's several of these that we've seen emerge. And so there is a role for the nonprofit world, not only as a potential investor, but frankly, as the platform for bringing, this level of competition and performance together. Am I saying that right?
1,000%. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. A good example of this is the city of Norfolk ran a competition around for sea level rise related issues around HUD money. And they actually have a dedicated, Richard, like you were just talking about, they have a dedicated nonprofit called Rise Resilience,
Yes.
that runs a series of basically competitions around various resilience related challenges in the Norfolk region specifically. And same thing, like I think it's been a really good, important catalyst for jumpstarting innovation on resilience issues in that region.
Unfortunately, we were trying to get one of the two folks from Norfolk, but given that it's the end of the year and all, but they have agreed, Ellory, to reconnect right after the first of the year. But wanted you to know that through you and others, we want to bring.
I'm sure
Okay.
They would have a lot of. Yeah, and I'm sure they would have a lot of lessons, honestly.
Yep.
Okay, the last example that I want to give, or the last new tool that I want to throw out there, we've already been talking about a lot, is performance contracting. Of the three of these kind of new procurement approaches, a performance contract is by far the most complicated and difficult to actually execute, but it has the highest upside, which is that it ensures the delivery of outcomes that are actually desired by the city. So it's got, it has the highest barrier to entry, but it has the highest upside. I already mentioned this. Ultimately, performance contracts, in order to actually execute on these well, it requires a tremendous amount of baseline data to set what those performance metrics are going to be and what the various trigger points are going to be for payments. And that it requires a lot of internal capacity to actually do. There are some really good examples of where this is happening in the resilience and water sector. You guys are probably familiar, but like the DC water deal, Atlanta has a really has something in the works with Quantified Ventures. Another good example, not water related as much, is CCMUA, Camden County MUA. Its microgrid project is another good example. And again, there's definitely been a tremendous amount of progress that's been made, I think, in local governments across the country. But those existing upfront barriers, I think, remain. The capacity issues definitely remain. Questions about that?
I guess I have one is, and I want to be mindful of time, but
I'm rolling up on my last recommendations.
But no, I don't mean to eat up so much of time, but I did want to throw some questions as we also look for others to jump in. But is there a hybrid? Is there kind of a first version of performance contracting that's a little bit of a hybrid that helps build confidence for governments choosing to go down this path, or is it kind of an all-in feature?
So the hallmark of a performance contract, in my opinion, is that payments are actually tied to performance.
Right.
That requires that it's pretty all in. Yep. Right? In order for everything to be legal, above board, like that in and of itself, right? When a government's payments are triggered by various performance metrics or
Yep.
performance milestones, I think that in and of itself means that it's a fairly all-in proposition. Because again, it just like requires the monitoring and the legal and financial structuring. It's not a minor enterprise, right, for a local government to actually execute on making payments based on performance. Because ultimately, right, it's not a well-trodden path in a lot of local governments. The stepping stone to getting more comfortable with performance contracts is doing what I was talking about, which is working in that more outcomes-based, performance-based lens into your standard procurement processes. So you might not necessarily be tying payments to it, but you're setting expectations, you're setting KPIs, you're setting all of those things in terms of like how the agency is going to be evaluating the success of the procurement, and all of that are tied to these more outcomes-based metrics that are not just lowest cost. And you can do that, right, in a stepping stone kind of way.
Right. And in Ellory, the other end of the extreme is that there's been, and I think we're beginning to see this in some of the water related, but if you hit your metrics earlier, there's also some places that are considering a certain additional kicker on the financial as an incentive.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning not to be sloppy about it just to get to the goal line faster, but frankly, in an example that I used way back in my U.S. Department of Commerce days, after the earthquake in California, we helped bring together in finance and did a public-private partnership. Unbeknownst to most people, the U.S. Department of Commerce has the capability of doing this. But if you remember, the Embarcadero major highway collapsed, and that was into the financial district. And essentially, there was a performance-based contract used, but it also said for every day early, the team gets $1 million, right? Still having to pass the full inspection and all. So have you seen that begin to emerge of late, as well as some incentives on being both thorough and a little bit, faster in the timeline of delivery?
I think I've seen them as more one-offs. I don't think I've seen it across the board as much,
Okay.
but I think it's awesome. I think
Yeah.
that's I think that's awesome.
Yeah.
Right? I think ultimately, right, in that example that you just gave, I would want to be really careful about what kinds of incentives I was setting up
Yeah.
for the people who were building the project, right? Like, if all of their incentives are to get everything rolled out as quickly as possible, and there are huge financial incentives associated with that, I would want to make sure that there were protections against cutting corners.
Sad but
that.
true. Sad but true, where this ends up being used the most, and it may not be referred to as performance contracting, is during emergencies.
Yeah.
Provided exemptions or waivers
Yep.
that allow the system to work. And I keep on saying one of the best ways to see innovation in practice is to look at where waivers and exemptions have occurred. And that's what I was kind of referring to, is in a lot of these issues around resilience, we are dealing with disasters or trying to prevent a disaster, right?
Absolutely.
And so if it's good enough to get a community back on its feet after disasters, my question is how do you feel comfortable using it as a standard feature for all future, infrastructure? That may be a rhetorical question.
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't necessarily have an answer right off the bat, but I think it's an important question to be asking. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm gonna move on to my last 2 points. So my first 2 points were focus on scoping out the problem or the pain point, not necessarily prescribing the solution. The second was to consider using new tools. And the third is to not start from scratch. And we've been talking about this, but ultimately, there's a lot of progress being made in local governments across the country, and not just across the country, right? Around the world. The United States is actually pretty far behind when it comes to performance-based contracting and outcomes-based procurement. There's been some pretty tremendous progress made in Australia, for instance, and in Canada. And I think it behooves us to look at what other local governments have done and to not recreate the wheel. I'm sharing on this screen. These are screenshots of some of the case studies in the Atlas case study database that I referenced earlier. I encourage you guys, it's publicly available, free, all that kind of good stuff, to search through that case study database and look at some of these examples. Ultimately, right, if we know that a procurement went really well, I encourage local government officials to copy and paste scopes of work, right? Modify them obviously for their local context, but like if they know that the city of Boston got incredible responses and incredible P3s or whatever to one certain solicitation, I think it behooves all of us to seek to replicate that and not start from scratch. Okay, I gave you my three most important recommendations. But now I want to give like some really quick tips and tricks. These are like quick and dirty tips and tricks to move the needle towards more performance-based procurements. The first is don't bury the lead. Traditional RFPs are long, boring, and they take like 60 pages to get to the actual scope of work. I'm seeing a trend in a lot of local governments that are moving the goals and the desired outcomes of a procurement all the way up front, and they're outlining in very clear, simple steps how to submit a response. And I think that's a really good trend, and I encourage everybody to do that. The second is to know what you don't want in responses and to actually say that explicitly. The city of Boston does this with really great success. They do it in their smart city playbook. Very explicitly, they say what's off the table. And it's a really good thing to just set expectations, especially on a P3, if you're seeking to explore P3s. The third is to walk in a bidder's shoes. This is, coming from government myself, this can be really difficult. But ultimately, if you're seeking to have more public-private partnerships and you're seeking more creative solutions to these really thorny resilience issues, I think it behooves us in local government to really put yourselves in a bidder's shoes. Take time to explain to bidders why they should want to work with your local government, why they should put in the upfront time and resources to actually develop a really thoughtful proposal, and to, same thing, spend the upfront time and effort making your solicitation as attractive as possible to the most diverse group of bidders as possible. It's upfront effort, but it's well worth it. The next one is to look beyond your budget. In traditional procurement processes, and you guys know this better than I do, but in traditional procurement processes, typically the procurement doesn't go out until the money is secured. Many of the issues that we are dealing with in local government right now, especially when it comes to resilience, have to do with a financing gap. Like I said initially, that financing gap can be part of the solicitation.
Yep.
Right? Like you can actually write in to the problem statement that in a way that it includes alternative financing goals or P3 goals as a part of the solicitation itself. And in doing that, right, it allows local governments to draw forward solutions that have built-in business models. And that's ultimately, right, like that's the stage for a really successful P3. Next one is to show your work. Every private sector company I know likes to work with local governments that are engaged and committed partners. And transparency about when and how decisions are being made is really key to building trust. Same thing goes with like open data, right? If you're soliciting for alternative finance arrangements for resilience, providing access to data surrounding some of that goes a really, really long way, right? The next one is to take down unnecessary hurdles. That kind of like goes without saying, honestly. That's like take a step back, critically evaluate where the bottlenecks are, where the delays are happening, and do everything that you can to slow them down. But again, I think that goes without saying. Everybody talks about that one. And then the last one is to get the word out. I think a lot of the local governments that have seen tremendous success in doing some of these more innovative partnership arrangements or more performance-based contracts, they've done a really good job of building buzz around a certain solicitation, whether it's social media or partnering with nonprofits and universities to get the word out, whatever that may be. It can go a really, really long way in attracting really high quality bidders who might not necessarily be attracted to working with a smaller or medium-sized local government. I would argue like just posting on your city website, if you're doing a more innovative type of arrangement, just posting on your city website is not going to be sufficient. And that is it. The last thing I wanted to say is, and I think I mentioned this, but a lot of what I was sharing today is based on work that we did with the support of the Xprize Foundation and in partnership with Refocus. And all of these materials that I've been presenting are available on our website. So you're more than welcome to go there and click around yourselves.
This has been great, Ellory. I greatly appreciate it. I wanted to say to folks who are with us, if they'll stick with us for just a few minutes, we got started a little bit later because we wanted to make sure folks could join in. Ellory, I've got so many questions, but I want to I have a thought as a follow-up. But one question I have is, have you found some of the folks that you've worked with and some of the case examples, is there an interest and willingness for that peer-to-peer type of communications? Because, you know, as much as you and I and Mike and others can, you know, serve as the bridge and share some knowledge, I think it's still building confidence in hearing from a peer. What have you sensed? You know, is there a forum, or is there a way? Is it something that the Atlas does periodically? Is it bring some of these elected and appointed officials and kind of make it an open, you know, type of peer-to-peer network? Or what have you seen, or what could we be doing?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, that's what the Atlas is. It's an online community, a peer-to-peer learning network for local government officials. And really what motivated us to build it is that as we were doing pursuing very specific projects with local governments on resilience and sustainability, like every local government has to do its own due diligence before they pursue something new. So they want to be able to say, such and such city looks just like me. They pursued a very similar project. This is how much it cost. These are the partners that they worked with. These were the outcomes. And, oh, by the way, Mr. Mayor, I talked to the public works director who was directly responsible for implementing that project in such and such city. And I got all of their recommendations about what they would do differently if they did it again. And every single local government I've ever worked with has had to do some variation of that due diligence process before they do or try anything new. And that's the case with, like, this sounds ridiculous, but that's the case oftentimes with like buying a $5,000 new software, all the way up to something huge, large scale when you're talking about like a huge capital resilience project.
Yeah.
That same thing is true across the board. And ultimately, it's a big, how slow that process is a big barrier to local governments doing something new.
Right.
And that's the pain point that we're out to solve at the Atlas.
So this is a nice segue to Mike Gardner. And Mike, as I'm shifting over to you and asking you to, you know, begin to set up and show a little bit of what we've been trying to do with the marketplace, something comes to mind, and that is that we need to, capitalize on the relationship with Ellory and her team by also being able to provide access to some of these resources. And I think there's a way to do that, Ellory, and we can talk about, you know, how to make sure as folks are looking at how to plug into some of these new opportunities in P3s, not just in Texas, but other places. Again, there's a lot of resources, and the Atlas to me is one of the best, you know, excellent ones. So Ellory, thank you for doing that. Mike,
I appreciate that.
Mike, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I started sharing my screen. Are people able to see it now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so Ellory, what a great presentation. Thanks a ton. And you've given me, you know, I wanted to jump in with a million comments and questions, but I kind of held off. But you have given me a lot of different things to kind of focus on and talk about. I'm going to try to do that in 8 minutes, maybe something like that, because I know people have to move on to other things. But what I'm showing right now is a schematic of what we've actually set up as what Richard has mentioned already, the Texas P3 Resilience Marketplace. And this is using a Kayak software, and in a minute I'll switch and I'll show you a very quick demo of a Kayak software in action for this marketplace. But teeing in on several key concepts that Ellory mentioned, she mentioned the need to basically solicit ideas. And Houston in particular, Texas in general, is in a pretty challenging situation. If we just look at Houston after Harvey, various people got together and did the math and said, oh my goodness, we need 60 billion in resilience financing. You know, that's going to be hard, but let's get started. And, you know, a couple years later, they've actually secured many, like 12 or 14 billion in federal funding from various sources, but they now need to figure out, well, what's that going to go into? And and so they need to basically solicit project ideas. Of course, they have some already, but they need to solicit others. But then eventually they need to unlock additional forms of capital, private capital from either philanthropies or from investors and so forth. As projects go through successive phases, they need to basically be able to use that public money to unlock things. And all of that can be accomplished with the marketplace we've set up. Also, one of the key things that Ellory mentioned was using data and information as the basis of the contracts and as the basis of the covenants regarding the financing, and being able to monitor that data. And that is all built into the marketplace. And I'll show you examples of that in just a minute. But essentially what the different nonprofits and agencies collaborating in Texas and in the Houston area can do is they can run campaigns to solicit ideas. The ideas can be typed directly as project proposals and project descriptions directly into our cloud software in a very structured way, so that every single submission is standardized and looks like the other, so that there's not this huge variation in the submissions basically. And then the different agencies can use our software to be able to screen them and evaluate them, to rank them, and eventually to be able to match them to the right funding source. And in the first phase, again, it's going to be some federal funding sources, but eventually it'll be to, this is going to take years, but eventually this will lead to other funding sources. And then, as I'd mentioned, they can use agreed upon models and data sets, public data sets and others, to be able to do that. So, that's kind of the overview of what we've set up for the Texas P3 Marketplace. And this is actually the Texas P3 Marketplace. What we're looking at here is a catalog of demonstration projects that we've populated in. So to be clear, these are real projects, but they're not actively looking for funding in the Texas P3 Marketplace. We merely put them in to help people understand what's happening. So this is a catalog of different projects, and there could be any number of other projects coming in that can be, again, created via these self-serve listings. What we're seeing here on the catalog front page is we're seeing some indication of what the cost of the project is. We're also seeing these rating scores, and I'll come back in a minute and talk in a little bit more detail about what these ratings are. But at a glance, they let you see what, whether the project, what the confidence is that it could be constructed on the proposed schedule, what the financial confidence is in kind of the business model of that project, also what the environmental benefit is, and then finally what the social benefit is in terms of either equity and diversity and inclusion goals, or in terms of job creation and GDP and things like that. By the way, we can add any number of other scores. And so, for example, if there was a computation based on data that was kind of the progress of that project toward the agreed upon payout goals that Ellory was talking about in a performance-based financing, we can have icons that would show that. And so they would show, hey, we're 80% to that payout goal, basically, or something like that, basically. I'm going to open up this project. I just want to show you a quick example of what it looks like inside a project. So we have the project basics, so you can see a summary. And again, all this could be created by anybody, by the agencies and the nonprofits, or just by citizens who want to submit ideas. We have information on the organization behind it. That's a critical thing in terms of understanding who might be behind it. We also have images. This is important for a few reasons. In the end, it creates context, but it also can create a kind of emotional connection to the project. We also have a data room where all the documents, and you could have dozens of documents if you wanted. All of them can be in one place. They're available for people to see. There's security controls over this. Some of the documents you might not want everybody to see. Some of them you might want everybody, everybody in the public to have access to. So there's granularity of being able to manage the document access. And then finally, we have a tool that allows showing the capital history of the project. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this, but this is important in terms of understanding, well, what are the prior financings that went into this? And also this can be used, by the way, in conjunction with performance-based finance. But let me go back and show you another very important tool for that. I just clicked on this that I want to see some water data, and it's making a call to a public data set right now and retrieved it. That data set actually has something like 100 million records in it, and we just went off and did a quick call, and we can create virtually any type of dashboard. This dashboard is intended to prevent context on the project that's being proposed. and in this case, it's water quality data. What is, the kind of ambient water quality data today? But we could just as easily, and we do this normally when we do these implementations, we can create dashboards. So for example, for some of these performance-based metrics that Ellory was talking about, you can have a data feed coming from sensors. You could have data in spreadsheets that are being compiled and going through kind of a review process on the data. And at the point that they've been approved as being ready to be the definitive source of data, they can get populated into a dashboard like this so that you can then see, well, here is the status of those covenants, and here's the status of those performance conditions that were agreed upon in the financing. Again, this dashboard is not doing that, but it's easy for us to create dashboards like that from virtually any data source. I'm not going to show it, but we also can create smart contracts. So we also have an ability to go create a smart contract on a covenant, so that for some of the metrics and KPIs and conditions that Ellory was discussing as being boundary conditions and covenants on the financing, we can actually create smart contracts on that, and we can do all kinds of different things with that smart contract. If you don't know what a smart contract is, it's software that is tied to data. It has certain properties of being highly secure and really, really, really hard to tamper with and change. Therefore, you can trust it. Therefore, it is an efficient way to automate a lot of dimensions of the interactions that Ellory was talking about. Because at the end of the day, one of her first slides said, you need an efficient system to be able to do that. And at the end of the day, that's what we have been building with the Texas P3 Marketplace. We're just starting a pilot. We're inviting agencies to come in and spend time with us on an unpaid pilot, basically, and you'll be hearing more about that if you're one of the local agencies and nonprofits. You'll be hearing more about that shortly. But that's a very, very quick sketch of Akayax and of the P3 Marketplace. I don't know if there's any questions about any of that. I'm happy to take them if there are. And of course, I went through really quickly.
Well, Mike, one of the things that you and I've talked about, and I think this is a way to close the year and focus on what we'll be doing in the fifth and final webinar. But what you and I are going to get an opportunity to do is actually film a little bit more of an in-depth demonstration of the platform and how it can be used. And so we'll be getting that out to all the folks that have participated and some who have not been able to participate but have been looking at the YouTube's videos of this. And I think as Mike said, we're moving down the path now of looking to get a pilot launched to leverage the federal, state, local dollars, along with some recently identified, which you'll hear about in January, some recently identified philanthropic and we believe insurance dollars that want to start playing in this space, so to speak. I don't really mean to use the word play, participate and have an impact. With that said, we look to making sure that you all have access to all the information and data that's been shared. We've been recording these, and then we will look at sending out the invite for early January. We want to tie this to some recent discussions that have occurred, not just in Texas again, but we sense that there are legislatures, Ellory, across the country, there's city councils across the country, and with a transition in Washington, I think this is now the time to look at how do you package all of this up and make sure that the opportunities to push this into, whether it's a legislative agenda or some opportunities to pilot these types of projects with some of the new leadership at the federal, state, local basis. And so that's one of the areas that we'll focus on, is how to create and use these tools to bring public sector agencies, legislative leadership, city council members into an opportunity to really test drive what we're talking about. So with that said, I want to thank Ellory for all the time. We're looking forward to our partnership and collaboration, of course. And Mike, to you, your patience in getting us through 4 of these webinars. And I know we look forward to filming and producing a little bit more of the demonstration and sharing it with all of our participants. So thank you all, and please a safe, healthy Thanksgiving with you, your families, and thank you for all your interest, and we look forward to continuing our partnership and relationship. Thank you all.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Ellory. Thank you, Richard. Take care.